Hello YouTube. With the all-new Oblivion Remaster on the way, this seemed like the perfect time to look back at some of the series' lore that's essential to understanding Oblivion's story. In this video I'll give you some context to the main story, such as the life of Emperor Uriel Septim VII before the game, Martin Septim's hidden backstory, and the beliefs and motivations of the game's primary antagonists, the Mythic Dawn, alongside some other interesting things you may not have known yet about the game's story. All with timestamps so that you can skip something if you'd like. Now, fair warning, this video will have significant story spoilers, so if you're going to play Oblivion for the very first time with the remaster releasing, maybe bookmark the video and return later. So, that having been said, let's start with the backstory and early life of Emperor Uriel Septim VII, after the intro. So, Emperor Uriel Septim VII. He was the 21st Emperor of the Third Tamrielic Empire, or the Septim Empire, in its final years, and he is the Emperor of the Empire during most of the mainline Elder Scrolls series, from the Elder Scrolls 1 Arena to the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. Now, Emperor Uriel only comes on screen in 3 of those games, but makes the biggest appearance in the beginning of the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, where he decides to free the player character from prison just before being assassinated by Mythic Dawn cultists, setting off the plot of the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. But prior to his assassination, he lived a long and busy life, a life which started in the year 346 of the Third Era, 85 years before our playtime in the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. Now, not much is known about Uriel Septim's early life, other than that we know that he was a handsome and clever young man who in his very early years used to have an imaginary friend named Justine. That's literally all we know about his childhood. Now, we do know a little bit more about his later life as a prince, as when he came of age it turned out that he was very gifted, inheriting some of the best qualities of his ancestors. He was a hard worker, he had integrity, he had a shrewd sense for politics and had great military prowess, having military successes from a very early age. As a prince, it's likely that he was part of the military unification campaigns of his father, Emperor Pelagius Septim IV, who during Uriel's birth was in the midst of a long process of trying to truly unify Tamriel. You see, while the Third Empire, or Septim Empire, technically spanned across all of Tamriel, the Empire had always been more of a loose collection of alliances, which all paid tribute to the central government in some way. But other than that, they were all mostly independent. In some places there was almost no imperial authority, and throughout much of its history parts of the empire even fought one another in civil war when the vassal kingdoms had disagreements, with some of these wars being absolutely disastrous to the local area. In addition, it wasn't too rare for local lords to straight up rebel against the empire, or for different parts of the empire to temporarily break off and start a civil war under different emperors. Like during the War of the Red Diamond, an imperial civil war that I covered earlier on this channel, and a video on that is in the description if you want to know more. One of the reasons for all this internal turmoil was really that to many the only reason the empire existed was because of its dragonborn emperor, as the Septim emperors all held the dragon blood, and those with the dragon blood were the only ones who in those days could light the magical dragon fires in the capital. As long as these fires burned, the mortal plane, the dimension that Tamriel is in, would be protected against invasions from the Daedric planes of Oblivion. This is why the Emperor had such an important position, and why many places of the Empire were more or less just part of the Empire in name because of its ruler, while being functionally independent and not really caring about Imperial authority. The final few Septim Emperors tried to remedy all this by trying to create a more unified and centralized empire, with stronger Imperial authority in the provinces and Imperial culture and religion being stronger in the provinces, as in some provinces such as Blackmarsh, Morrowind and the Somerset Isles, the native customs and traditions and religions were far stronger than those of the Empire. Now, Uriel's father, Pelagius IV, therefore undertook many initiatives to try and strengthen imperial culture and authority, a process which did not always go peacefully, as some parts of the empire, such as Blackmarsh and Morrowind, would prove to be very resistant to this process, meaning that the emperor often sent the imperial legions to establish imperial authority by force, and it's likely that Prince Uriel was part of these missions after coming of age. Now, this process of unification continued after Emperor Pelagius IV's death in the year 368 of the Third Era, 65 years before our playtime, with Prince Uriel Septim inheriting his father's throne and being crowned Emperor Uriel Septim VII. Now, it's said that during the early years of his reign, Emperor Uriel was a much more fair ruler than his father, but despite that, he continued the unification process that his predecessors had started, using military force when needed and sometimes leading his own troops into battle during these efforts. Overall, in the early years of his reign, it's said that he was an optimistic, fair and talented ruler, and he was well liked by most of the citizens of the imperialized regions. It's also during this time that he married the woman that he would have his legitimate children with, a woman named Kaula Voria, and reportedly very beautiful woman, was very popular with the Empire's citizens. He would father 4 children with her, 1 girl and 3 boys, by the names of Princess Ariella and the 3 princes, Girdle, Anman and Abel. Unfortunately for the children, they would have a less than happy childhood, as their mother, behind closed doors, was a manipulative, arrogant and ambitious woman who seemed to have vied with her husband for power as she'd more or less seduced him into marriage in his younger years. This meant that Emperor Uriel would quickly come to regret this marriage, and it led to a marriage with a lot of fighting behind closed doors, where Emperor Uriel and Empress Karla would often try to hurt one another, something which made for a particularly unhappy childhood for his 4 legitimate children. Now, during this unhappy marriage, Emperor Uriel also fathered 2 illegitimate children, as he reportedly slept with several of his aides. One of his bastard children, a son named Calaxus, would be acknowledged and would be adopted by the emperor, gaining the status of prince and eventually getting an influential position in the imperial city. The other bastard would remain a secret, as he had him taken away to an inconspicuous place by his secret service, the Blades. This bastard son was Martin Septim, who plays a big role in the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion's main story. It's also during this time of unhappy marriage that the Emperor started to put a lot of faith in an ambitious yet apparently very trustworthy advisor that he took on. He started relying a lot on this man for advice and for magical services, as he also fulfilled the role of the Emperor's personal battle mage, and he became one of the Emperor's most trusted friends. The man that I'm talking about is Jaegar Tharn, a member of the incredibly powerful Tharn family, which had long held positions of political power in Cyrodiil and were regulars on the Elder Council of the Empire. This bromance between the two would lead to much success in Uriel's unification attempts, as he got more foothold in Morrowind during this time, and in other places of the Empire. Unfortunately, the bromance would come to a very abrupt end, as there's a reason why Jaegar Tharn is often called the Betrayer, because he betrayed the Emperor. And not in a small way, as his most trusted friend and advisor used his magic to secretly imprison the Emperor in a small pocket realm of Oblivion, where the Emperor would remain unconscious for 10 years, suffering from perpetual nightmares, while Jaegar Tharn used his magical skills to magically disguise himself as the Emperor, taking over the rule of the Empire for 10 years, while the real Emperor Uriel was imprisoned. This period we call the Imperial Simulacrum. It was a time where Jaegar Tharn, as the fake emperor, rarely showed himself to the public in order to avoid any chances of being found out, while at the same time woefully neglecting the Empire's rule and its internal politics, which allowed the Empire to first stagnate and then internally fracture, as many of its vassals once again regained de facto independence, stopping paying taxes and in some places openly defined imperial authority. And yet, fake Emperor Uriel did almost nothing against it, as Jaegar Tharn, disguised as the Emperor, mostly just seemed to have enjoyed the luxuries of being Emperor and holding all the power. But fortunately for the real Emperor Uriel, the Eternal Champion, the player of the Elder Scrolls I Arena, intervened during the events of the first game, as the player manages to kill Jaegar Tharn and free the Emperor once more so he can return to his rightful position to the throne. However, 10 years of imprisonment with eternal nightmares and betrayal by your closest friend really does something to a man, as the Emperor's confidants describe him as a changed man after this. He was no longer the youthful and brash emperor of his youth, rather becoming very patient and cautious, with a grave and calm personality. He seemingly wasn't particularly paranoid or anything like that, but he did become very pessimistic and often dealt with things clandestinely, under the table, using the Blades, his de facto secret service, to silently deal with problems across the Empire and influence political relations, instead of the brash military campaigns and grand political gestures that he employed in his youth. It's during this time of his reign that the Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall and the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind take place, and in both cases the player is sent somewhere silently on orders of the Emperor to solve an issue. In the Elder Scrolls II you're sent to High Rock as an agent of the Emperor to solve some rising tensions, while in the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind you're a prisoner the Emperor sent to Morrowind, where he has the Blades aid you in becoming the Nerevarine of Prophecy to deal with the threat of Dagoth Ur, and possibly also with the ulterior motive of you getting rid of Morrowind's living gods, the Tribunal. Now, how the Emperor knew that this random prisoner he sent to Morrowind was a sort of chosen one, we don't really know. Although it's likely that the prisoner in some manner appeared in the Emperor's dreams, as Emperor Uriel, seemingly after his imprisonment in Oblivion, often had strange and future-revealing dreams, which is likely the reason that he sent the Nerevarine to Morrowind in the Elder Scrolls 3 and why he saw his own assassination coming in the Elder Scrolls 4. Although it seems not everybody believed too much in the future predicting powers of the Emperor's dreams, as the Blades, which again served as his de facto secret service and also were responsible for his protection, believed that they would be able to protect the Emperor from whatever he'd foreseen. However, this was not the case, as we find out in the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion's prologue, because earlier on that fateful day when our gameplay starts, the Blades and the Emperor had gotten reports that his children had all been assassinated by Daedric cultists of the Mythic Dawn, meaning that publicly known he had no living heirs left. The Blades then decide to secretly evacuate the Emperor out of the city to a safe house before the cultist assassins can reach him and kill him too. It's here where we meet the Emperor in the game, as his secret escape route leads through our cell, and it's during this attempted escape that the Mythic Dawn assassins manage to kill Emperor Uriel right in front of our eyes, snuffing out the dragon fires that Uriel had lighted in his youth and starting the invasion of Tamriel by the Daedra, who are now open to invade the mortal plane. This sets off the events of the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, where we as the players search for the Emperor's secret bastard son Martin and attempt to prevent the fall of Tamriel to the Daedric hordes by trying to relight the dragon fires. But now the question remains, why exactly was the Emperor assassinated? The simple answer is of course to make Mehrunes Dagon's invasion of Nirn possible. But why did so many people join the Mythic Dawn, and why would they think it's a good idea to have Mehrunes Dagon invade Nirn? Let's talk about that now, when we're talking about the Mythic Dawn, who they were, what their history is, and most importantly, what they believe. So, the Mythic Dawn, a Daedric cult of the Daedric prince Mehrunes Dagon that nearly toppled an empire and destroyed the world. In its heyday during the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, it was a large-scale secretive Daedric cult which had a large membership base all around Tamriel, as hundreds if not thousands of Tamriel citizens were led to believe in the secretive cult's heretical beliefs. We know that all across Tamriel they had members, from agents and assassins carrying out the cult's business, to belief spreaders and even a lot of sleeper agents in a network all across Tamriel. That network was eventually used by the cult leadership to assassinate the Tamrielic Emperor, Emperor Uriel Septim VII, and all his heirs. But what drove that many people to join the Mythic Dawn? Well, the Mythic Dawn offers an interesting alternative to most Tamrielic mythologies, a different view as to the structure of the universe and what the end goal of a mortal should be on Tamriel. You see, most people on Tamriel believe a variation of the following story. There's three types of gods: Aedra, or divines, Daedra and Magna Gi. And most people believe a variation on that the mortal plane of existence, Mundus, was created by a spirit named Lorkhan, who together with a large group of other powerful spirits started constructing the mortal plane at the very beginning of time. This all went pretty well, until the spirits that were helping Lorkhan discovered that building this mortal plane actually drained their power and vitality. This led to a conflict while creating the mortal world, and while the different religions on Tamriel disagree about the exact order of events, what happened in most religions is that it's said that some spirits fled creation when they discovered this, that their power was being drained, which then ripped holes into the mortal plane, which then became the stars. These fleeing spirits became the Magna Gi, while some other spirits stayed behind to finish creation. These spirits were called the Aedra and allegedly lost a lot of their power in creation and would later come to be known as the Divines, like Akatosh, Dibella, Stendar and many other gods, even some from other pantheons. Meanwhile, the Daedra were those spirits who refused to even participate from the start and never had anything to do with creation. Now, these Aedric spirits, who would later become many of Tamriel's most common gods, viewed Lorkhan either as a trickster or as an outright enemy, depending on the religion, after they discovered that their power was being drained. And they then punished him for tricking them into creating the mortal plane by severing him from his heart. A variation of this story exists in many of Tamriel's religions. However, the members of the Mythic Dawn believe that the history of the universe as told by most priests on Tamriel is a blatant lie, and that the Aedra are false gods. You see, the Mythic Dawn believes that Lorkhan was a Daedric prince, the original Daedric prince of change, and that the mortal plane Mundus was supposed to be his Daedric realm of oblivion. But that it was the Aedra who betrayed him by stealing his domain for themselves, and according to them, this betrayal caused the Magna Gi to flee creation before Lorkhan's plane was properly finished. This caused for Lorkhan's creature creations, you know, like Daedric creatures, like Dremora, so to say, to be severed from his divinity and led them to become mortal instead of immortal, like the Daedric creatures that we encounter in the games, who after they've been slain regenerate in Oblivion and are then able to come back. These creations of Lorkhan, these creatures, his immortal Daedric servants, that was supposed to be us, or well, the now mortals of Tamriel. The Mythic Dawn view this mortality that the betrayer gods pushed upon them as an injustice and see the Daedric gods as betrayers who took our immortal birthright, which the Daedric prince Lorkhan envisioned from us, and they took that away. They then believe that the Magnagi, the faithful of Lorkhan, who fled after the betrayers killed him, created Mehrunes Dagon, the Daedric prince of chaos and change, as a sort of concerned brother to Lorkhan, intended to be his avenger and take back his brother's creation and set the world right once more, giving mortals their immortality back and stamping out the betrayer Aedra. That is, in very short, what they believe. Now, if you want to see an excellent 40-minute analysis and explanation of their beliefs and some more of the justifications on why they believe it, I'll put a link in the description of this video to a video by fellow Elder Scrolls YouTuber Daroloth, who examined the text of the Mythic Dawn until he became a madman, and he can explain their beliefs in far greater detail and in far better analysis than I ever could. So be sure to check out this video after this one if you're up for some more mythology. But what I told you is the basis of the Mythic Dawn's beliefs. They believe that it is necessary to give Mehrunes Dagon access to the mortal plane so that he can set things right and give them their birthright to immortality and remake them in the image that Lorkhan had originally envisioned. But where do these beliefs originate from? Well, they originate from the foundational texts of the Mythic Dawn, Mankar Cameron's commentaries on the Mysterium Xarxes, a 4-volume book series which outlines the foundational beliefs of the Mythic Dawn as written down by their leader, the half-high elven Mankar Cameron. Again, if you want to see a thorough analysis of all those writings, check out Daroloth's video in the description. Now, Mankar Cameron is very much a subject for his own video, but what you need to know is that he allegedly is the son of Haemon Cameron, a Bosmer king of Valenwood who would come to be known as the Camoran Usurper, as he nearly toppled the empire using an army of undead and Daedra 166 years before his alleged son would nearly topple the empire with his Mythic Dawn cult. It was a young Mankar Cameron who became a devout follower of Mehrunes Dagon, even becoming a champion in the eyes of the Daedric Lord, which led Mehrunes Dagon to bestow upon his follower the so-called Mysterium Xarxes, a Daedric artifact in the shape of a book filled with Mehrunes Dagon's own words, his own profane knowledge and his own great power. Now, for mere mortals, it's dangerous to even look at the pages, as any normal reader would easily be overwhelmed and corrupted by its contents, and only one of great will and power, or a champion of the Daedric Prince himself, may safely read it. From within the pages of the Mysterium Xarxes, Mankar Cameron distilled his theology and wrote his commentaries, the 4 books which would come to be used as a guide and indoctrinate many of Tamriel's citizens into the Mythic Dawn. But his theology is not the only thing that he grasped from the pages of the Mysterium Xarxes. From its pages he also learned how to create his own pocket realm of Oblivion, within Mehrunes Dagon's own realm. This realm he would go on to call Gaiar Alata, or Paradise, and he promised that his and Mehrunes Dagon's followers would there be granted immortality, until they would be able to receive it in the Mundus, which would by then, in their endgame, be a Daedric plane. And that their immortal spirits would in Paradise be trained to eventually rule the mortal plane once Dagon had retaken it from the betrayers. At first, Mankar Cameron tried to spread his own beliefs openly, but he was ignored by the masses, and then, according to his own words, he started preaching these beliefs in secret, and slowly, most likely attracted by the mystique of such a secretive alternative heretical belief, he gained followers and was able to found the Mythic Dawn. Although it's also possible that the Mythic Dawn already existed in some form and that he simply came to lead it at this point in time. Mostly everything points towards him founding it, but a possible typo in one of Oblivion's voice actor scripts dates the Mythic Dawn earlier than his birth, so yeah, that may also be possible. Anyway, Mankar Cameron had gained quite a massive following by the time of Oblivion. Loyal true believers who believed that by following him, someone who according to his followers could converse with Mehrunes Dagon as an equal, they would one day become immortal and become the new ruling class when Mehrunes Dagon would walk Tamriel again. These people turned their backs upon the Aedra, who according to Cameron were weak and cowardly, and started working to get their lord into the mortal plane. But that was not too easy. You see, ever since the first era, when the first Dragonborn Emperor started ruling the Empire, starting with the slave queen Alessia, who had freed humanity from their alien elf oppressors, Tamriel had been protected against the invasions by the Daedra. The story goes that as long as a descendant of the first Dragonborn Empress, Alessia, would wear the Amulet of Kings, a sacred amulet which allegedly houses the souls of Alessia and her descendants, as long as a Dragonborn Emperor wore that, her descendants would be able to light the dragon fires in the Temple of the One in the Imperial city, which then kept the so-called liminal barrier in place, which prevented Mehrunes Dagon or any other Daedric prince from doing too much crazy stuff on Tamriel. So, extremely oversimplified, if Dragonborn Emperor light fire with amulet, Mehrunes Dagon go fuck himself. Alright? So, as Mankar Cameron, what do you do then? You start using your cult followers to work on a plan of making sure that the Emperor and his heirs are killed off and that the Amulet of Kings is stolen, so that none may light the fires ever again, and the liminal barrier disappears, making your lord Mehrunes Dagon able to conquer the mortal plane and set things right, at least according to them. This part of their plan is actually successful. After years of intense preparations and spying and infiltration, in which they even have one of their agents secretly marry one of the Emperor's sons, watch my video on that for the full story, they got into position and murdered Emperor Uriel Septim II and all his heirs, and eventually even managed to steal the Amulet of Kings. Of course, the Mythic Dawn never learned of the Emperor's bastard son Martin, who together with the hero played by the player in the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, the hero of Kavach, would go on to foil their plans by killing Mankar Cameron in his paradise and then beating back Mehrunes Dagon himself as he tried to walk the face of Nirn, by Martin sacrificing himself and transforming into an avatar of Akatosh, which then defeated Mehrunes Dagon and permanently sealed the barriers between Nirn and Oblivion, ensuring that no Daedric prince would ever be able to threaten the mortal plane again on that scale, or so was the plan. But even that would in the end not really prove true, although it did make things harder. But that's a subject for another video on how that all worked. That being said, what happened to the Mythic Dawn after their plans were foiled? Well, first of all, those who died and went to Mankar Cameron's so-called paradise soon discovered that it was a paradise exclusively for Mankar Cameron. Within it, they were put to slavery and were tortured. What a great afterlife. Although kinda deserved after what happened, but hey. I read a theory online somewhere that the torture is supposed to make their souls immortal in some way, so that Mankar Cameron actually never lied to them. But I don't know, it still kinda feels like a scam if you promise people paradise, but it's not like they care what I say. Now, second, the followers that still lived by the end of the Oblivion Crisis mostly disintegrated. From what we know, most people on Tamriel were not even aware of the Mythic Dawn's involvement in the start of the Oblivion Crisis, but once they found out about the Mythic Dawn's involvement, dedicated groups of hunters started hunting down the remaining Mythic Dawn faithful and started to exterminate them and their remaining bases wherever they could. They even managed to get their hands on Mehrunes' Razor, one of the artifacts of the Mythic Dawn and Mehrunes Dagon worship, and they managed to break it into 3 pieces, which then led to the whole creation of the Keepers of the Razor, as they called themselves, as they tried to keep the different pieces of Mehrunes' Razor apart from each other as long as they could, in order to make sure that the Daedric Prince could never entice people with it again to do really bad stuff on Tamriel. Now, it was only really until 200 years later or so in the 4th era, around the time of Skyrim, that the Mythic Dawn gained at least some historical recognition again, in the Dawnstar Mythic Dawn Museum, where we can do a quest with Silas Vesuvius, someone who is a descendant of some Mythic Dawn members, who tried to start a museum, and nobody really liked that, because it turns out that even 200 years later, people are still kinda mad at the Mythic Dawn. In that quest we can also find some of the descendants of the Keepers of the Razor, and we can, take the different parts of Mehrunes' Razor, bring them back together. That quest. Now, something that most people don't know is that in Creation Club content, which has been confirmed to be more or less canon, the Mythic Dawn even have a very short-lived revival when a priest named Vonos gets a vision sent to him by Mehrunes Dagon, and he managed to reopen an Oblivion Gate using pieces of old Oblivion Gates they dug up all around Skyrim, and using the presence of the soul of the last Dragonborn, the player character in Skyrim, in order to reopen that Oblivion Gate, trying to unleash a second Oblivion Crisis. But Vonos was killed by us, and that portal, which he did manage to permanently open, was put under the surveillance of the vigilance of Stendarr, who will probably find a way to close it at some point, although if that piece of Creation Club content is the source of a second Oblivion invasion in the Elder Scrolls VI, well, I guess you heard it here first, folks. I mean, Creation Club content seems to be canon, since Bethesda themselves paid for creators to make it for them on their instructions. So, hey, We might never know, but it seems like the creators of those Creation Club content DLCs actually got a lot of freedom in how they wrote, and they didn't really get a lot of input, so I don't know how the canonicity of that is, but it felt worth to at least mention it. And that was the story of the Mythic Dawn, at least most of it. Again, if you want a full analysis, completely in depth of their beliefs, I really recommend Terralot's video. Now, for this video, it's time to move on to our next subject, and that is Martin Septim, the bastard son of Emperor Uriel Septim VII himself, who will be with you during most of the adventure. Now, part of his backstory is kind of hidden. I mean, did you know that he had a history with Daedra worship himself? Probably not. So, let's talk about him. Over the course of his reign, Emperor Uriel Septim VII established himself mostly as a well-liked and fair ruler to the people of Tamriel. However, his reign was not without incidents, as several urgent crises happened during his reign, such as the Imperial Simulacrum, the period of time of the Elder Scrolls I arena in which the Emperor himself was captured and kidnapped by Jaegar Tharn. You also had the events of the Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall leading to the Warp in the West, and the Dagothur crisis in Morrowind taking place during the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind. Now, all these crises were terrible for the people of Tamriel in their own right, but by far the most destructive and biggest crisis developed in the last few days of Uriel Septim VII's life, as on the 27th of last seed of the year 433 of the Third Era, the Emperor was told that all of his children were assassinated, all his heirs were dead, and someone was hunting down the Imperial line. To such a degree even that the Emperor's eldest son, Prince Geldal Septim, was killed by his newlywed wife, who turned out to be part of the cult hunting down the Septim line. Now, the organization responsible for this tragedy was of course the Mythic Dawn, Mehrunes Dagon worshippers whose aim it was to have no more Imperial heirs of the Dragonborn Septim line left on Tamriel, so that none may light the dragon fires which protect the world against invasions by the Daedra, leaving the door open for their lord, Mehrunes Dagon, to conquer the mortal world and turn it into chaos. Now, of course, when Emperor Uriel Septim VII and his bodyguards, the Blades, heard the news of these assassinations, the Blades tried evacuating him from the Imperial city to save him from assassination. But as anyone who played Oblivion's opening knows, they failed, as the Mythic Dawn managed to ambush the Emperor and his protectors, leading to the Emperor's ultimate death in presence of the player. But fortunately for all of Tamriel, Uriel Septim VII had a big secret. He had a bastard son hidden away. A bastard son born out of an affair between Emperor Uriel Septim VII and a girl that we only know of as Gemil, who seemed to be some kind of palace worker according to unreliable documents, as she would ultimately deliver the baby at the palace. This affair, however, was the result of Emperor Uriel Septim VII's unhappy marriage to Empress Kala Voria, which made him miserable and caused for a lot of infighting in the Imperial family, and likely did not give his other legitimate children a very happy childhood. But despite how miserable the marriage made Emperor Uriel, I think that in the end everyone on Tamriel should be kinda glad that it happened, as that is what led to the affair that gave them Martin Septim, the last of the Imperial line who would ultimately save all of Tamriel. Now, like I said before, Martin was born seemingly within the Imperial Palace, with Emperor Uriel seemingly present at his birth, and it's been suggested that it was him who also gave his bastard son the name Martin, although it's a bit unclear, as some have suggested that his later foster parents might have given him the name, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here. On the night of his birth, the then captain of the Blades, who formed the palace guard and close friend of Emperor Uriel, Joffrey, was called into the Emperor's private chambers. That night, Emperor Uriel handed him a basket with the sleeping child Martin. He did not say whose child it was, but Joffrey, who already knew that it must be the Emperor's son, was told to find a safe place for the child to grow up. Joffrey then took the baby and disappeared with him into the night, and Joffrey traveled long until he found a place where he deemed the child could grow up in peace and in prosperity, with a widowed farmer near Kvatch. Joffrey then put the basket and the child on the farmer's doorstep and left Martin's fate in the farmer's hands. There, Martin grew up without knowing anything of his true parentage. He believed for years that his mother, just like his father, had been a simple farmer and had died during childbirth. He had no contact with his actual parents as far as we know, as while the Emperor would ask his friend, now Grand Master of the Blades Joffrey, to keep an eye on the boy and keep him posted on how he was doing in life, there was no actual spoken contact from what we know between Martin and his father. And it also seems that Martin apparently did not know his true mother, not in any way. In fact, we know very little about her, although there is a suggestion that she may have been killed on Uriel's orders around 16 or so years after Martin's birth, suggesting that the affair with his mother might have ended badly, or perhaps he threatened to reveal Martin's existence or something like that. Truth is, we don't know. At the farm where Martin grew up, he grew up healthy and strong, and it was likely around puberty that it became clear that he also had quite some magical talent, as he was invited to come and study at the local Mages Guild in Kvatch. However, there his life would end up taking a bit of a darker turn, as at the Mages Guild he made friends with several other mage apprentices. All of them were ambitious, including Martin, and over time they all became obsessed with ever stronger types of magic, and they became frustrated with all the rules and restrictions of the Mages Guild. Martin and his friends hungered for more, they wanted more, and that led them to walk an alternative and darker path as Martin and his friends joined the Daedra cult. Now, they didn't join a particularly bad one or anything, in fact they ended up joining probably the most fun one, the cult of the Daedric Prince Sanguine, Daedric Prince of drunkenness, partying and debauchery, whose worship is conducted in fun but not very YouTube friendly ways. Just imagine the word bunga twice and add a lot of alcohol to that. Alright, now eventually Martin became quite a prominent follower of Sanguine, even being something of a chosen, as it's said that for a time Martin even held the Rose of Sanguine, the Daedric Prince Sanguine's most well-known Daedric artifact, which Martin apparently used to amass more power for himself. Now, something else about his time in the cult, which is pretty interesting, but is just a theory that some of the people in my comments on my video on Uriel Septim the Seventh's legitimate children pointed out, is that Martin, while in the cult of the Daedric Prince Sanguine, almost certainly had lovers, which means that he might have some bastards of his own out there, which is a complete theory, but I like the theory. Some people have even suggested that if that theory is true, the last Dragonborn may descend from Martin. I'm not sure about that, but it's an interesting theory nonetheless to think that Martin may have his own bastard children, but we don't know about that. It's just an interesting theory that I thought to share. However, what we do know about his time in the cult is that at one point everything apparently went wrong. Martin describes that at some point his friends died in some tragic accident related to the cult, and from that point on he was ridden with guilt and shame and turned his back on the Daedric Prince and Daedric worship altogether. It is here at this point in time that Martin sought atonement for his sins, entering the priesthood in the great cathedral of Akatosh in Kvatch, working for many years as a priest of the Eight, hoping to atone for his past sins, becoming a selfless man who shunned power rather than seeking it. It's here at the cathedral, several years into his service as a priest, now going by the name Brother Martin, that his life would be completely turned upside down. You see, the Mythic Dawn, while they assassinated his father, brothers and presumably others in his family to instigate the Oblivion Crisis, did not know of him, but it's always been speculated that the Daedric Prince Mehrunes Dagon did know of him, or at least felt his presence in Kvatch, as one who could light the dragon fires. Or perhaps the Mythic Dawn did somehow find out about his existence without knowing specifically who he was, because for some reason, likely because of Martin's presence, Kvatch was chosen as the big starting shot of the Oblivion Crisis. As far as we know, Kvatch was the first mortal city to be laid to waste in that crisis. During the attack on Kvatch, just before we meet Martin, we find out that he did not flee the city, but barricaded himself inside the chapel of Akatosh instead, helping to save the lives of those left in the city and the soldiers still trying to defend it. It is here in the chapel where we can meet him in the game, help him find out his true identity, after which we can take him to the Blades, where they will protect him, while Martin and the player work together to end the Oblivion Crisis over the course of the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. To the player, he plays a bit of a supporting role throughout the story, helping the player unravel Daedric mysteries, using the knowledge and powers that he attained in his days in the Daedric cult, which allows him to handle Daedric artifacts better than others, which leads to him helping the player decipher the Daedric artifact of Mehrunes Dagon, the Mysterium Xarxes, in an effort to end the Oblivion Crisis together with the player. Ultimately, Martin would be Emperor for about a day, as at the climax of the story he is brought to the Imperial city as the Elder Council accepted his claim as new Emperor. But as those who played Oblivion know, before he could officially be crowned, Mehrunes Dagon put all his forces, including an avatar of himself, to work to wipe the Imperial city off the map and kill Martin before the dragon fires could be lit and he could be banished back. When they arrive at the city and see the avatar of Mehrunes Dagon, Martin knows that it's too late to relight the dragon fires, as it would no longer help beat Mehrunes Dagon back completely. So, in an ultimate attempt to save the mortal world from the claws of Dagon, Martin uses his Dragonborn soul in synergy with the Amulet of Kings to shatter it, and unleash its power by transforming into an avatar of the god Akatosh, a massive golden fire dragon that can beat Dagon back to oblivion. But that heroic deed also ended his life, and Martin sacrificed himself in the end for all of Tamriel, ending the Oblivion Crisis, and to many he would go down in history as the Septim Emperor with the shortest reign, but perhaps the greatest of them all. By many he would be considered a hero of mankind on the level of Tiber Septim himself, and he cemented his place in history as an emperor who one would remember for centuries to come. Like I said before in the intro, in a way you and Martin are both main characters, and if you had to pick a chosen one in this story, and I'm defining chosen one as someone who will save the world from an all-great evil, like the last Dragonborn in Skyrim or the Nerevarine in Morrowind, then that chosen one would likely be Martin and not the player. You essentially help the main character reach his destiny, which I personally always really loved as a dynamic in the game, and which makes Oblivion's story my favorite story in the series. And about that story, something really interesting is that in the shift from Oblivion to Skyrim, so after the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, we see that the Oblivion Crisis, so the story of Oblivion, truly changed Tamriel forever. So as an ending to this video, I kinda wanna talk about the long-lasting effects of the Oblivion Crisis, and how most of the problems that we see in the Elder Scrolls 5 Skyrim can still be traced back to what happened in Oblivion. The Crisis is at the center of the plot of the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, and during the game you help Martin Septim, last of the deceased Emperor's children, stop the Crisis and seal Tamriel forever against the invasion of the Daedran. Happy ending, you save the world, everyone's happy, and Tamriel will never be in trouble again. Except no, it's not, because despite Martin Septim and you, the player, stopping the Oblivion Crisis, the effects of the Crisis were so devastating that the damage it did to Tamriel was irreversible. And despite the Crisis ending, it happening in the first place set off a chain reaction of events, which to this day on Tamriel can still be felt, and is at the very core of most of the problems on Tamriel at the moment. So let's start with the origin of the Crisis itself. In order to instigate the Oblivion Crisis, followers of the Daedric Prince Mehrunes Dagon, called the Mythic Dawn, assassinated the Dragonborn Emperor Uriel Septim VII and all his known heirs. This left the Empire initially leaderless and extinguished the dragon fires which kept Tamriel safe from the threat of Oblivion and its Daedric princes. If you want to know more about how this works with the Dragonborn Emperors and the Dragon Fires, I recommend that you watch my introduction to the Elder Scrolls lore. A link to that is in the description. Anyway, what you need to know is that when the Dragon Fires were extinguished after the assassination of the Emperor, the protective veil between Nirn and Oblivion was suddenly vulnerable, and the Daedric Prince of Chaos, Mehrunes Dagon, broke through it, invading Tamriel to his Oblivion gates and spreading all his minions around to just kill, destroy and spread chaos all over Tamriel. Without an emperor, the Empire, then still spanning all of Tamriel, was leaderless and in peril. The High Chancellor of the Elder Council, a high elf named Okato, became the de facto leader during this crisis, as the people looked for a leader to guide them through the crisis, and he had the most central authority. If you want to know more about Okato, I made a whole video about him, it's in the description of this video. High Chancellor Okato did what he could to preserve the Empire, and for one of the most defining things that he and the acting Elder Council did, which would influence Tamriel for the next few centuries, was deciding that the central province of Cyrodiil needed to be protected in favor of the other provinces, as the central authority of the Empire rested in Cyrodiil. This meant that Imperial legions were pulled from several provinces in order to protect Cyrodiil. We don't know the exact troop movements, but we know that legions were pulled from Morrowind, elsewhere Blackmarsh, and perhaps the Somerset Isles in order to protect the Imperial heartland. This decision would prove to be one of the most influential decisions made in this period without an emperor, as it weakened several of the provinces, leaving some, like Morrowind, virtually defenseless against the Oblivion hordes. In several provinces, this created a feeling of resent against the Empire, as they obviously didn't feel very appreciated and felt like they played basically a second fiddle role to Cyrodiil. These sentiments would lead to Morrowind losing confidence in the Empire, meaning that the province would leave the Imperial sphere of influence in the future after the Empire failed to help them time and time again. As the weakness of the Empire after the Oblivion Crisis led to the Empire not being able to adequately help Morrowind when it was devastated again by a crisis, this time the eruption of the Red Mountain in the Red Year, which left the province even more weakened, uninhabitable in some places and generally starved the population. The Empire at this time, 5 years after the Oblivion Crisis, was unable to help them, as they were still weak themselves and dealing with massive crises everywhere due to the devastation that the Oblivion Crisis brought just 5 years ago. During these years, the Empire was still being led by High Chancellor Okato, at that point Potentate Okato. Potentate Okato wanted to find a new Emperor to lead and unite the Empire in the time of hardship, but in his 10 years of rule, which were the 10 years of complete chaos and economic crisis after the Oblivion Crisis, he failed to find a new Emperor whom the Elder Council wanted to unanimously appoint. This was because the Oblivion Crisis had made it impossible to find a new legitimate Emperor for all of Tamriel. You see, this is something else that the Oblivion Crisis caused, because before the Oblivion Crisis, an Emperor of Dragonblood was needed to keep the Dragonfires lit and protect the world against the threat of Oblivion. The Emperor's power and his legitimacy were based on him or her being able to protect Tamriel against Oblivion by lighting the fires, thus they had an almost divine right to rule. But now, after you and Martin solved this whole problem in the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion by forever sealing the barrier between Earth and Oblivion, a Dragonborn Emperor was no longer needed to rule the Empire, meaning that the throne was fair game for anyone, and at that point there was no one with enough influence to claim legitimate rule over the Empire, except maybe Okato, and that's why he became Potentate. You see, now that the Dragonblood was no longer needed, even a Septim Emperor, even a full-fledged heir of Uriel Septim, would not have the legitimacy to rule anymore, as his Dragonblood was no longer needed to protect the Empire, and to protect the world in that sense. Meaning that even if there was a Septim left to rule, the Elder Council may not even have accepted them as a legitimate ruler with a good claim to the throne, since everybody could just now claim the throne, since the Dragonblood was no longer needed. Only Chancellor Okato at this point had some legitimacy with the people of Tamriel, as he steered the Empire through the crisis, and to the people he was sort of the new face of the Empire, and thus he accepted the role of Potentate over the Empire, ruling it for 10 very difficult years after the Oblivion Crisis. But the problems didn't end there, because Okato's rule was weakened significantly by the lack of resources after the Oblivion Crisis, and due to his earlier decisions to pull legions from the provinces to protect the Heartland, resent had started to show its head in several different provinces. This would first culminate in Blackmarsh, where a faction named the Anselil took over the province and kicked out the remaining Imperial forces. This faction grabbed power after the Oblivion Crisis when they and the other Argonians were left to fend for themselves without the Empire, something that they did very successfully, closing many Oblivion gates by themselves. But the Anselil used the confusion after the Oblivion Crisis to claim that it was not Martin Septim and the player of the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion who ended the crisis, but it was them who had some secret plan during the crisis, who ended the crisis, and that they were the actual cause for the end of the crisis. They branded the Empire's claim that Martin ended the crisis a lie and spread their own propaganda across Argonia, that they were the one who ended the crisis. This created anti-Imperial sentiments, especially since the Empire left them alone during the crisis by pulling legions out, which allowed them to take power eventually. Which allowed the Anselil to take power. If you want to hear this story in more detail, I made a video on the Anselil, which is in the description. But the Anselil then, also after taking power, invaded Morrowind as a revenge upon the Dark Elves who enslaved the Argonians for years. And during this invasion, Okato was not able to help Morrowind with Imperial forces against the raging Argonians, once again leaving the province to basically fend for themselves, and once again being left alone by the Empire in their time of peril. This caused House Lalu, the most pro-Imperial great house of the Dunmer, to be ousted from the Council of Morrowind, and caused them and the Empire to become scapegoats for all of Morrowind's problems, causing Morrowind to basically permanently get a very bad taste for the Empire. And the Anselil weren't the only faction to lie about the ending of the Oblivion Crisis, as in the Somerset Isles, another anti-Imperial faction, the Thalmor, was able to grow very influential by claiming that they secretly ended the Oblivion Crisis, claiming that to their people, and not Martin, also using this lie to gain influence and eventually overthrow the pro-Imperial monarchy in the Somerset Isles. Many believe that the Thalmor were the ones who eventually also assassinated Potentate Okato after his 10 years of rule, although we don't have definitive proof for that. His death, though, quickly led to infighting in the Empire after he was assassinated, civil wars and complete collapse of the Empire's authority for a while on all of Tamriel. This was a 7-year period of infighting following Okato's assassination, and it was called the Storm Crown Interregnum, and it weakened the Imperial influence across all the provinces and made it so that when a new emperor rose to power, a conqueror named Titus Mede, he had to reconquer most of the human provinces, even needing to fight wars in Cyrodiil itself to re-establish his authority as emperor on the continent. His conquest as Emperor was quite successful, and he managed to basically reconquer all the human provinces and Valenwood and renegotiate a joining of Somerset Isles into the Empire with the pro-Imperial monarchy on the Somerset Isles. Only Elsewhere and Blackmarsh remained outside of this new conquered empire, with Morrowind's status being quite vague and unknown in this. We don't really get conclusive proof on whether they were in or out at that point. Anyway, good times for the new emperor. Except no, not good times. Because the Thalmor, who were very anti-imperial in their sentiments, overthrew the Somerset monarchy, who were pro-imperial, and declared independence from the empire. And several years later they also overthrew the pro-imperial governments of Valenwood in a coup, causing the empire to lose authority over Valenwood as well, as Valenwood was being incorporated into the new Thalmor-led state, the Altmerry Dominion. A cold war then started on Tamriel between the Empire and the Altmerry Dominion. The two states were basically each other's silent enemies, as it's called in the Elder Scrolls novels, despising each other deeply, and one could only wait until a war would break out between the two, and that war would, as most of us know, eventually come, after more than 100 years of silent Cold War, and eventually Elsewhere's entrance into the Altmerry Dominion as client states. The Great War between the Empire and the Altmerry Dominion would ravage over the entire face of Tamriel, leaving both states scarred, ending with the White Gold Concordat, which banned Talos worship, which created the civil war in Skyrim. If you look at it like that, you can see that even in Skyrim, 200 years after the Oblivion Crisis, Tamriel is still scarred and permanently changed by the effects of the Oblivion Crisis. Most problems Tamriel faces now find their root in the crisis, because, for example, the civil war in Skyrim and the Stalwarchers this year's in Skyrim, they were caused by the White Gold Concordat, which was caused by the Great War, which was caused by the Thalmor, who were able to rise to power because of the Oblivion Crisis. The current weakness and fall of Morrowind, what about that? Well, if the Empire hadn't pulled its resources out of the province due to the Oblivion Crisis, they wouldn't have been devastated by the Oblivion Crisis, meaning that they would have had far more resources to help themselves when the eruption of the Red Mountain happened, and the Empire would have had resources to aid Morrowind with the rebuilding, and the Ancellil would have never risen to power without the Oblivion Crisis in Blackmarsh, meaning that there would have never even been an invasion of Morrowind by the Argonians. The massive killings in Valenwood of Bosmer that were not loyal to the Thalmor, well, those Bosmer would never have had to rise up against the Thalmor if there were no Thalmor, who likely would not have been there without the Oblivion Crisis. The Orcs, being forced to move Orsinium, their homeland, well, if the Empire hadn't been weak after the Oblivion Crisis, the Orcish homeland would not have been able to be raided during the Stormcrown Interregnum, because it would have been properly protected by the Empire, which it had been during the Septim days. But it wasn't, meaning that after the assassination of Potentate Kaito and Chaos ruled in the Empire, Orsinium was able to be raided and destroyed, with the only orcs surviving the massacre being saved by the Imperial legions who had no central coordination from a war-torn Cyrodiil, where just, again, chaos ruled in the Empire. Even smaller problems like the Forsworn uprising in the Reach in Skyrim, if the Great War hadn't happened, that would not have happened, and if the Thalmor hadn't risen, the Great War may not have happened, and if the Oblivion Crisis hadn't happened, the Thalmor wouldn't have happened. My point is that even though the Oblivion Crisis was solved by the player and Martin Septim in the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, its effects were permanent, and the damage had long been done. The invasion had been stopped, but a chain reaction of events which would plague Tamriel for centuries to come had already started. It all started the moment that all the Dragonborn Emperors were assassinated, and that chain started, ultimately leading to Tamriel being ravaged by a massive war between the Empire and the Dominion, and Skyrim being torn into a civil war. Now, that having been said, that's about all for this video, and I really hope that you enjoyed it, and perhaps it got you in the mood to play Oblivion, or gave you a deeper understanding of the game's story. Now, if you are now in that third era Elder Scrolls lore mood, why not check out my long video that I did in collaboration with Mr. Timebomb, covering the entire Septim dynasty, from Tiber Septim all the way up to Martin. A link to that video is in the description, so perhaps I'll see you there, or perhaps I'll see you back for my weekly Elder Scrolls lore content. I usually upload videos every week. Bye bye!